Hello everyone, welcome to our next webinar, which is on coronavirus people issues looking ahead. What we thought we would do is summarise a few of the key topics that have just come up just in the last couple of weeks to help you get on top of them and be prepared for what I hope might be the final phase in terms of bringing people back to work and the last part of furlough. We're joined by 4 partners from the team today. We're going to cover some specifics on the second half of the CJRS, the CJRS 2. James Collings will be covering that. Claire Holland will then look at redundancies and notice pay and the interaction with furlough. Sarah Peacock will then be taking us through the provisions in relation to returning employees to work, such as travel issues, quarantine, what to do if an employee can't return to work. And then I'll wrap up at the end with some thoughts really on looking ahead. Once employees are back at work, what if you need to make big changes still within the business? What are the options for that? And looking at a few of the trends that we're seeing coming through in terms of the advice that we're giving to clients at the moment. In relation to how the session will work, it is on demand. So we've previously done these live, but we know how busy everyone is, and we've also had some requests where people would like to share these with their teams, because there is a lot of information in there, and hopefully giving you some really sort of practical advice on what to do next. So it can be downloaded on demand. You can still submit a question. You have to click on the bottom of the screen on the speech bubble, and that question will come through to us, and we'll be able to come back to you. One of the team will come back to you, and we'll also be running a couple of polls during the session just to give us insight into what you are looking at the moment and what's important to you. We want to make sure these sessions are really valuable and are covering the points that you want to hear from us on. So doing the polling really helps us with insight into that. So I'll hand over now to James Collings, and James will take everyone through the second half of the CJRS.
Thank you very much, Karen. Right, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a steer on the new developments under the job retention scheme, particularly those that came out on Friday night, just gone. So as some of you will have noticed, this is being referred to by some as the flexible furlough scheme rather, or an acronym within the legal community that some have been using is FFS, obviously. So where does that leave us at the moment? So from the 1st of July, what we now know is that you can only furlough an employee who's previously furloughed for a minimum 3-week period between the 1st of March 2020 and the 30th of June 2020. There were a few concerns there, I think, initially around whether that 3-week period would need to be the period immediately preceding the start of July, but that's very clear now that it can be at any point between that March and end of June point. So employees no longer need to avoid, from 1st of July onwards, employees no longer need to avoid doing any work for the employer, but they can work for some of the week and be furloughed for the rest, hence flexible furlough. That can be in proportions decided between the employee and the employer jointly. But one thing that is fairly critical on that is that the employer will be required to keep a new written agreement when implementing flexible furlough. So there will be a need now to have some clear written communication around what's agreed between you and the employee. Although, as before, what's been clarified is that you don't need to have a written response from the employee. There just has to be a written documentation showing what's been agreed. So from 1st of July onwards, the minimum 3-week period for furlough will go. So from there on out, there'll be no minimum period, although any claim through the scheme portal must be in respect of a minimum 1-week period. So you'll also not be able to make claims that cross calendar months. So there are some interesting considerations there for your payroll people. As the transition from this version 1 to version 2 takes place, where you've previously furloughed an employee that starts a new furlough period before the 1st of July, it's important to remember that they have to complete the minimum 3-week period. So if, for example, you started that period of furlough in the 1 week before the end of June, that would then need to continue for the full first 2 weeks of July. After that, they can be flexibly furloughed for any period. But because you can't cross months for claims from 1st of July, you're going to have to submit separate claims to cover a 3-week furlough period, which spans both June and July, if that makes a degree of sense. So what else? Employees can still take or be required to take holiday whilst on furlough, provided that the employee's pay is topped up to their normal remuneration for the time spent on holiday. We've had a few queries in relation to what that normal remuneration on holiday looks like, and it's actually quite a complicated question. So if you're having troubles with that, then do get in contact with us separately. So also from the 1st of July, you cannot claim furlough for more employees than the maximum number that you claim for under any claim period ending the 30th of June. So that's with the exception of those that are returning from statutory parental leave, so maternity leave or similar. So just to put that into context, if you made monthly claims between April and June 2020 of 100 employees, then 150, then 200 respectively, the maximum number of employees you can furlough in any single claim starting on or after the 1st of July will be 200. Now that may seem a little bit like white noise, but that is quite important for people who've been operating furlough on a sort of rotational basis across their workforce. So be aware of that limit on the number of overall employees. There are also new TUPE provisions, which mean that in respect of a TUPE transfer after the 10th of June, the new employer can furlough transferring employees, provided that the employees being claimed for were furloughed for a minimum 3-week period with their old employer, effectively, between March and June. So employees returning from maternity, adoption, paternity and shared parental or parental bereavement leave, they're still going to be eligible for the furlough scheme, even though they weren't previously furloughed prior to the 10th of June, provided that the employer has used the furlough scheme for other eligible employees by that date, which is a very helpful, albeit a fairly last-minute move. So what you're going to need to do is calculate the usual hours for an employee who you intend to flexibly furlough. How you do that depends upon whether their hours are fixed or not, and whether their pay varies according to the number of hours they work or not. So in some respects, quite similar to the rules around calculating their normal pay, but there are detailed calculation steps that are sort of set out on that link there within the government guidelines. Broadly speaking, though, for employees with fixed hours and pay, so salaried, a fairly basic calculation that helps you identify how many hours they normally work in each pay period. For those with variable hours or paid on a timepiece basis, you're going to need to calculate and use the higher of either the average hours worked in the 1920 tax year or the corresponding calendar year of the tax year 2019 to 20. So next step. So the other big bit around the announcements that came out last Friday night was this piece around clarifying this tapering of the support between July and the end of October when the scheme comes to an end. So a new document sets out the detail of how those grants are going to be tapered. But broadly speaking, I put a bit of a summary up there for you. June and July, the government still pays the 80% of wages up to the 2,500 cap, as well as the NI contributions and pension contributions. And employers will have to pay the furlough for the hours that they work when they're doing the flexible furlough piece. In August, government pays 80% of wages, as before, and employers will pay employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions for the hours the employee's on furlough. September drops down from 80 to 70% of wages up to the cap of 2,187.5 for the hours the employee is on furlough, and employers will pay employer national insurance and pension contribs, etc. Then October, the final step down then is to 60% up to the cap of 1,875 for the hours the employee is on furlough, and again employers will pay ER national insurance contributions and pension contribs and top up the employer's wages to again ensure that they receive 80% up to the cap of 2005. So nice and clear, but in the broader sense, no great surprises there whatsoever. Notably, the first time you'll be able to claim for days in July will be the 1st of July, so you can't claim for periods in July before then. And 31st of July is the last day that you can submit claims for periods ending on or before the 30th of June. So be aware of those dates. What I wanted to do then was just give a little bit of a summary for you all around some key action points that would be sensible for employers to look at now. The first one there is consider the scope to use the government contribution to holiday for previously furloughed employees, even where some of those are back to work now. So potentially looking at requiring minimum proportions of leave to be taken before the end of October or earlier if you want more contribution towards it, given the tapering. Now, I think we've sensed that quite a few employers have decided to make use of the that ability to force employees, if you like, to take holiday. But it's just very important to make sure that you're aware of that requirement to give twice as much notice of their need to take holiday as the amount of holiday you're asking them to take. So if you're wanting them to take a week, you have to give them a minimum of 2 weeks notice. Now, if you factor that in with how long we've still got the 80% contribution under the scheme, that doesn't necessarily give you a vast amount of time to implement if you want to use the full benefit of that under the scheme. So point 2 there is carefully consider what you would want to practically do in terms of flexible furlough for your business, and then look at what's a sensible claim period relative to your payroll and take the calculations from there. Now, what I've then said as well there is it makes sense to consider sort of chunking groups of employees together, because the calculations, as I'm sure your payroll teams will tell you when they look at the calculation methodologies, are a little bit heavy going. So actually chunking groups of employees together makes an awful lot of sense. Thirdly there, prepare and issue amended flexible furlough letters. That's a fairly key development. In terms of the content of those flexible furlough letters, to a large degree, the ones that people used initially to place people on furlough are a good starting point of those, but there will be some other things that need to be factored into those. In addition, looking at things like whether we're going to require the taking of holiday in those furlough letters will be fairly key. If any of you listening in do need some assistance in helping to prepare those flexible furlough letters, then do reach out to us, because we're working on some very good template precedents along those lines that we can assist with. Finally there from me, employees will need to finish the 3-week minimum period if any period of furlough started before the 1st of July. So as I said, you'll have to claim for that period in 2 different claims, given the no monthly cross claim rule. So it's worth considering, again, very carefully with your payroll teams, exactly how that's going to work, and plan that out quite carefully so that you don't hit any snags as you go. All in all, that's about it from me. So what I'd like to do now is pass over to Claire Holland, who is going to talk about redundancies and pay considerations. Thank you, Claire.
I am indeed. Thank you, James. Right, redundancies. I know that we have touched on collective redundancy consultation in our previous webinar, but I thought it might be helpful just to have a quick look at some of the common themes, but also where we have now had some clarification in terms of the kind of phase 2 of the furlough scheme. I think the key point for employers at the moment is to be thinking ahead. Like James said, you need to be thinking about how your business looks and how your operating model is going to be implemented for phase 2 of where we are now. Can your business afford the additional cost of the furlough scheme as of the 1st of August? And what staff will you need in the interim and the long term? So it's very much a case of looking at your business and looking at the impact of the increased cost of the furlough scheme as of 1st of August. And if you do think that actually you might need to go down the route of collective redundancy consultations, building in the timings around that into that overall furlough picture. So with 20 plus employees, if you're proposing to dismiss 20 or more, then you'll need to carry out collective consultation for 30 days before the first notice of dismissal takes effect. And if you're looking at 100 plus, then it's 45 days. So it's just working back from the 1st of August with those timings in mind. So 20 plus would be the 30th of June and 100 plus would be the 15th of June, which was yesterday. So it's just important to be thinking ahead and also thinking about timings around, for example, electing reps. So if you haven't got a rep body at the moment or trade union reps, that's another step that you'll need to factor into your timings. Just in terms of collective redundancies generally, the common themes that we're seeing, is looking at the numbers, how many employees. The legal test where collective consultation is triggered is proposing to dismiss 20 or more employees at one establishment within a period of 90 days or less. So it's looking at that threshold number. And that will include voluntary redundancies. It will include those that you are settling out under settlement agreements. It won't include fixed-term employees whose fixed-term contracts are expiring during that period. But it's just really a case of looking at the numbers and making sure that you're getting that right. The second point is just on establishment. The legal position's probably clearer than it has been before, but it's still very much the two approaches of the geography or the organisation of the business, although they tend to lead to the same result, and geography tends to be the main factor. But the second question you'll need to ask yourself is whether employees are assigned to that establishment. So if you have a mobile workforce, then it might not be quite so straightforward. The other thing just to mention actually as well is that if you have got a group business, so you have a number of employing entities, the collective redundancy numbers and the threshold for that is only looking at one employer, so that might help to keep your numbers down. The second thing just to bear in mind is your HR1 form notifying the Secretary of State of your proposal to dismiss 20 plus, and it is a criminal offence, and there are some quite hefty fines if you don't do that. It also requires you not only to submit your HR1 form, but also in that form you have to include the identity of your reps, and you have to provide the reps with a copy of that form. So if you are looking to settle out 20 plus employees, so not necessarily carrying out full collective consultation, you will still need to make sure you take that step to avoid that criminal liability and potential fines. And the last point just to mention, which people do tend to forget, is that individual consultation is still needed. So it may be as part of your collective consultation process you agree something with the reps in terms of how that looks, but it is still a legal requirement and should take place once you have collectively consulted on the proposals. And next slide, just touching on the practical considerations. And again, this is more about looking at your business and thinking ahead about what you're going to need to do to make sure that you're carrying out collective consultation, not only from a legal perspective, but also in terms of engaging your workforce and doing it in the right way, given the difficult circumstances that we're operating in at the moment. So first, thinking about how you elect reps if you need to do that. How's that going to work logistically? Because you should be carrying out a ballot process, comms, how you're going to speak to your people, and how you're going to hold meetings. So again, it's just a case of thinking about that early. Have your, can your IT team put something on your intranet? Do you need to get an outside external provider to be involved? And there are those providers out there. And just how you're going to engage your people through this quite difficult time. The other thing to remember is that you are legally required to provide provide the reps with access to the affected employees, and you're also required to provide appropriate facilities. And again, that's going to be quite difficult at this time. So it's really making sure you do all that you can do to try and help that process. And equally, I've mentioned training reps there. We find that does facilitate the process. It does also get engagement. So that's something we can help with if you would like to engage and go down that route. Furloughed employees, I think this was an area where we have had clarification. So furloughed employees can be made redundant. That was a question mark at some point back in the near past. And you can carry out collective consultation with furloughed employees, and they can be reps for those purposes, provided they're not generating revenue or providing services, which tends to be the case. And it's also been expressly confirmed in the government guidance that furloughed employees can continue as trade union reps. So that has been cleared up. The special circumstances defence, now that exists already. It is, though, a very high bar. So where it's not reasonably practicable for an employer to comply with their collective consultation obligations, then you can, in very limited circumstances, put forward that defence. I think that it will, from a timing perspective, it will be quite difficult, given that the furlough scheme was in place, and the whole point of it is to give businesses that cushion. So I think it will still be quite difficult to run that argument. It may come into play. We're looking at the process, as I said, given that you might not have people in the office, people working from home, people that might not have access to computers and IT. So it may be something that tribunals take into account, but I would certainly say that as a business, you should be doing all that you can to consult in the best way possible. I think that's probably the best rule of thumb. Next, redundancies and pay considerations. And this is something that we are seeing a lot, particularly the first bullet point, which is when you're making somebody redundant who's furloughed, do you pay them the furlough rate or top up the furlough rate to their full notice pay during the notice period? There's nothing in the furlough scheme preventing employers from claiming for furlough pay during notice. So I think that's fine. It shouldn't affect your claim, but the risk is potentially around unlawful deduction of wages claims from employees. Now, there's a lot of commentary out there about whether you can pay furlough or you need to top up. I think there's probably three main things to remember. If employees have the statutory minimum notice, and they should be paid full pay anyway, that's the statutory position during their notice. If their notice is more than a week above the statutory minimum, then you then have to look at their contract. And then it's the question about what is normal pay. And this is the point that I think people are getting themselves into a bit of a few problems with, because it isn't entirely clear. I think that it comes down to what you've agreed with employees in terms of the furlough letter, what they have actually consented to when they when they've been put on furlough. So I think the starting point is to look at your furlough letter, but I think it would be very difficult to argue that they agreed to the furlough rate of pay in the knowledge that they were going to be made redundant. So I think it will be difficult to argue that their normal pay isn't their contractual pay for those purposes. But I would say start with your furlough letter, come and speak to us if it's not clear. But I think most employers were finding a topping up. Just in relation to employees with variable pay, then the furlough rate does come into play, because you look at the 12 weeks previously to work out what their normal pay is. So that could include a period of furlough pay. Other thing just to flag on that actually is to avoid paying in lieu of notice, because that would be full pay and you couldn't claim under the scheme. Just quickly on the last 3 points, so holiday pay, this could be complicated for workers with variable pay or hours, because it's actually a different calculation to the calculation for notice. That's looking back 12 weeks, but holiday pay changed this year, so it's a period of 52 weeks that you have to look back over. So you could end up with a different rate of pay, and it may be a cost saving if you do it on that basis, but it might also be a headache trying to carry out these calculations. Calculating redundancy pay, that shouldn't be impacted by furlough pay for employees that have got normal working hours. That should be their contractual rate of pay. Again, though, with employees with variable pay or hours, it's the 12-week looking back period. And the last point just to mention with all of this is a lot of decisions are going to be made, not so much on the legal basis, but also on your own financial position and cash flow. It may be that you decide not to top up during notice because you'd rather push it down the line and deal with it and pay employees at a further point down the road if they did look to bring a claim. The only thing I would just say on that, though, is that a tribunal, they normally do award the amount that's been deducted, but they do have a power to award appropriate compensation for other financial loss. So, for example, if as a result of the deduction, so if you pay furlough rate, the employee in notice, the employee brings a claim on the basis of the full rate. If they'd gone into their overdraft or something similar as a result of that deduction, a tribunal has got the power to award a little bit more. And the other way to deal with it could be just to wrap it all up in a settlement agreement, and then you get some clarity on the position. That's it from me. I'm now going to pass over to Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So many of you will now be thinking about your employees returning to the workplace if they haven't done so already. We ran a webinar previously that focused on returning to work issues and covered a lot of the health and safety aspects. So if you missed that webinar, you can listen to it again, and I've provided you with a link there. This webinar, what I'm doing is very much focusing on just 3 aspects, and that's travel quarantine, ongoing shielding, and time off for children. So the government introduced quarantine rules from the 8th of June, requiring any travellers coming into the UK to quarantine for 14 days. And a breach of that was going to incur a fixed penalty of £1,000. I've included a link to those guidance if you want to have a look at them. So what this means is that if your employees travel abroad on holiday, when they return, they'll need to self-isolate for 14 days. Now, at the moment, the Foreign Office is advising against anything but essential travel, but obviously that could change. The government's going to review the quarantine rules on a 3-weekly basis. So the next review is the 29th of June. But in the meantime, you need to decide and prepare for how you're going to deal with any issues if your employees are planning to go abroad. So can you stop them going on holiday abroad? Well, I think probably not, but what they're not entitled to is a further period of leave without your authority. So this might not have occurred to employees. They might think, well, actually, you know, if the government require me to have a period of quarantine on my return, then that's my right. So it's much better if you start communicating with your employees now so that they're prepared and you can manage their expectations. If your employees can work from home, it might well be that you're quite happy for them to have a period of working from home when they come back from holiday. If they can't work, do you have to pay them? Well, arguably in those circumstances, if they don't work, there's no right to be paid. Now, there's been no government guidance on that. There has been some commentary about whether the statutory sick pay regulations could be amended so that that would include people on quarantine. I'm not sure how likely that is. However, assuming there's no right, there are a number of options that you can consider. So firstly, you could agree for them to have an additional period of holiday. However, they might not have sufficient holiday accrued to be able to do that. Another option is to consider parental leave. Obviously, parental leave is for the purpose of childcare, but it might well be that a number of your employees do have childcare issues that they'll need to deal with while quarantining. The other possibility, of course, is furlough leave. That's still an option for the time being, certainly till the end of October, but that's going to start costing you money. And you need to remember that you need to have furloughed employees previously. You might decide that you just want to deal with any employees talking about going abroad on a case-by-case basis, but it is key that you make sure that you deal with them all consistently. Have in mind indirect discrimination. So if you have a policy not to allow leave following a holiday abroad, it could place employees of a particular race with relatives overseas at a disadvantage. It might be that you need all hands on deck and the business just can't cope with extra additional leave at this time. So it could be objectively justified if you refuse that additional leave. And if additional leave would substantially impact on your business, you might want to make it very, very clear to your employees in advance that that sort of leave will not be permitted. But I would recommend that you do make exceptions in some cases. So it might be that employees have relatives abroad that are sick, or they have funerals to attend, or a wedding, or something quite significant, and you might want to make exceptions there. There's also the possibility that some employees have already booked holidays abroad before these quarantine rules even came out, and they could lose substantial money if they cancelled. So I think it's just sort of a question of being fair and reasonable as far as possible, and maintaining those good relationships with your employees. Ultimately, if an employee takes unauthorised leave, that can be addressed through the disciplinary procedure, and potentially you could dismiss them. But it will very much depend on it being fair if you've communicated that previously, how their particular circumstances affect it, and whether you followed a fair procedure. So do think carefully about going to those extremes. It could well be that very few employees actually are planning trips abroad, so it's not going to be a huge offer, a huge issue. Also, it might well be that the quarantine period is for a very limited period of time. I understand that British Airways, Ryanair and EasyJet have also filed a formal challenge to the travel quarantine policy. So watch this space, it might not be around for long. You'll see on your screen a poll, so it'd be quite good if you can please participate in that so we can sort of gauge how many people are actually concerned about that. So the next issue I'm going to talk about is ongoing shielding. So you'll all be familiar with shielding by now. For those employees that are extremely clinically vulnerable, they're still being advised to stay at home as much as possible. They are now allowed out as long as they socially distance, so they can have a bit of exercise and things. But the guidance says every effort should be made to enable them to work from home. Have in mind as well that these employees are highly likely to be disabled within the meaning of the Act, and therefore you do have a duty, an obligation to make reasonable adjustments. And this could in fact include things like changing their role on a temporary basis so that they can actually work from home. So if they can't work from home, do you need to pay them? Well, most employers have been quite happy to have them on furlough leave, and of course that's still an option, but as we've heard from James, there will be some cost associated with that from the 1st of August with an increasing burden. And of course an employee doesn't have a right to be furloughed, so you might decide that you're not going to cover that cost, and certainly it's not going to be an option after October. If they're not on furlough leave, then they are entitled to SSP. You might also decide to pay them contractual sick pay, even though it's unlikely that they have a right to that because they're unlikely to actually be sick as such. But do check the wording of your policies. Also, if you're not paying full pay, you do need to be aware that if an employee feels that if they went to work, it would put them in danger, and they might then therefore say that the detriment is that you're failing to pay their full wages. The protection from detriment or dismissal applies under Section 44 of the Employment Rights Act. And Section 44D says, in circumstances of danger which the employee reasonably believes to be serious and imminent, and which they could not reasonably have been expected to avert, they left or refused to return to their place of work. And then under Section 44E, it says, in circumstances of danger which the employee reasonably believes to be serious and imminent, they took appropriate steps to protect themselves or others from danger. So that could be staying at home, of course. There's very little case law on this, and we would hope that non-payment of full wages would not be considered to be a detriment, but it's just something that you need to be aware of, particularly if you're actually thinking about requiring those employees to return to work. It is, of course, an option to dismiss these employees if they're incapable of working. That's something that they might be saying that I'm not prepared to return to work until there's a vaccine available, and that could be some time away. But, you know, I would seriously advise caution if you're taking that approach. Have in mind the Section 44 claims that I've just referred to, also disability discrimination, and also potentially whistleblowing, particularly if they've raised concerns about the workplace being unsafe and other things. So as you can imagine, this is a topic that could be a whole webinar in itself, and it's fraught with danger. And so please do feel free to give us a call if you're concerned about that. I've just highlighted a few things to keep in mind. Finally, the last issue that I'm going to address with people returning for work is that of childcare. We touched on this in our last webinar, and we actually ran a poll to see how many people were concerned, and it was 38% of our attendees of that webinar that were concerned about how they were going to cope with employees who had childcare responsibilities and weren't going to be able to return to the workplace, particularly having in mind that schools are unlikely to open fully until September at the earliest. So what can you do? Well, of course, furlough is still an option. It's something that you can still continue with, but again, that will have a cost to it. Again, employees don't have a right to be furloughed. So the best approach really is to have good communication with your employees and see if you can reach an agreement with them on a temporary basis. So options include holiday, for example, if they've got sufficient holiday to take. There's dependence leave, but that's only really intended for sort of short duration to deal with an emergency, so it's probably not appropriate here. Parental leave, again, that's unpaid, and see if they're entitled to take that. And also make sure you check your policies, because it might well be that they're entitled to pay through their contractual right. Also have in mind that an employee has a right not to be subjected to a detriment for making a request for dependent or parental leave. And if they're dismissed because of that request or taking that leave, it would be an automatic unfair dismissal. So you always need to handle these requests with care. If none of those are available, then of course you can just agree to a period of unpaid leave. However, this isn't going to be of any help to you if you actually need a workforce operating your business. So another option is to consider flexible working. So they might not be able to come back full time, but it might be that they can reduce their hours or work in a flexible way by sharing childcare with other people in their household, with their partner, for example, or with a parent that's no longer isolated. And you can, of course, include some flexible furlough leave. It's a bit of a mouthful, that, with that, so that they've got a combination of flexible furlough leave and some working time as well. Again, you need to have in mind indirect discrimination. If you have a working arrangement that requires employees to attend work or not to be able to work flexibly, it could place women at a particular disadvantage, as they are still more likely to have childcare responsibilities than men. So therefore, if you were going to insist on them coming into the workplace, you'd need to justify that requirement. So lots to think about there. An option is, of course, to terminate their employment if they're incapable of working. But I think, it would be far more reasonable to think about even having a sabbatical for a while or a period of unpaid leave, because that's quite an extreme route to take. So that's all from me, and I'm now going to hand you over to Karen, who's going to look ahead to recovery. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Right, so what I've done is just in this last few minutes, just wanted to take you through a few of the other options that there might be in responding to all the massive changes that businesses are facing at the moment. So really what I've done is think about what are the most sort of commonly occurring queries that we are getting at the moment, and just sort of running through the key themes. So I think the first one of those is, the high level of change that is happening at the moment. It might be that you need to look at specific changes for individuals in terms of their job role or, their work environment. Lots of different things. And so a common query that we get is around, if I do X or Y, would that be constructive dismissal? Look, personally, I'm fairly relaxed about constructive dismissal claims. Successful constructive dismissal claims are pretty difficult to establish. Every year we do, I would defend a few that are high value and, quite significant. But on the whole, a worry about making changes and that resulting in a claim, I think, can sometimes be overstated. So I think it is about voluntary agreement. But sadly, when you look at what's happening in the jobs market and the economy at the moment, I think the fact is that there is going to be a lot of pressure on the jobs market. So will employees genuinely resign and bring a constructive dismissal claim over changes? Probably unlikely. So it's not a charter for being a bad employer, but I think, you know, if there are changes that need to be made on an individual basis, going to employees and asking for their agreement, absolutely the starting point, and maybe easier than you expect. Obviously, if there's a change to salary or benefits, that is harder and that is a more obvious area for claims. So proceed with a bit more caution there, but again, still might be possible. Leading on from that, thinking more widely, if you actually have to make changes for a wider area of the workforce, as Claire touched on earlier, if you are looking at changes that mean you need to dismiss and re-engage on new terms and conditions, so it's more likely to be a change to benefits or to salary, possibly to workplace, if you're giving up your office location and asking people to work from home in the long term, then you will need to look at collective consultation for that in the same way as you would for redundancies, and you need to fill in the HR1. I freely admit that doing that is not easy, because when you get to the HR1, it's really not designed well for that process, but it is important. So do think about that if you have wider changes to implement. You can, of course, try and reach voluntary agreement on those changes as well, particularly if you have good trade union engagement. You may well be able to get them through collective consultation. Just a word of caution, we've seen a fair amount of engagement with the unions over trying to make changes, perhaps withdrawing, you know, bonus schemes or other schemes that have been in place in the past that aren't appropriate at the moment. And there have been a few issues with unions raising the issue of the business then seeking to go directly to employees if they can't reach agreement with the trade union collectively. It is something that you can do, but I do take advice about it. It does need to be done carefully to avoid the risk of a claim from the trade union that you are trying to effectively work around collective bargaining. Moving on to settlement agreements, again, Claire mentioned, of course, that if you've got a wide number of settlement agreements, 20 or more, you do need to look at collective consultation. But just thinking about individual settlement agreements, I have seen an increase in requests for advice on individual settlement agreements, particularly senior exits. A lot of restructuring going on at the moment. I think partly because of the current environment, perhaps businesses looking and thinking about a refocus of the skills they need for the future. I think the sort of period of disruptive working, has made a lot of boards look at their strategies for the long term. So settlement agreements, absolutely still a really valuable tool. Just beware, though, I think at the moment, because there's so much disruption going on, people are perhaps rushing those conversations a little. It is important that until that settlement agreement is binding, it isn't effective. So the usual things around being careful about cutting off access to the system or telling other employees that someone has left before they've signed the agreement can lead to trouble and can lead to them bargaining for a higher exit package. So the usual caution around that. And just to flag, we have got the pre-termination negotiation process that you can use. I think that is valuable and worth looking at and considering. If you do need to have a without prejudice conversation with an employee who has no idea that there is an issue that would cause the business to want to ask them to leave, that pre-termination negotiation is a pretty effective tool. So final thing on that, just preserve the open process as well. It may be that you're taking steps to achieve a number of exits through settlement agreements, but that can take time. And while you're doing that, you need to think about whether you need to start the clock running perhaps on other formal consultation processes and or need a paper trail of why perhaps it's taken so long between one period of consultation and another if you're negotiating settlement agreements. We are finding that employees are able to seek advice even in the current circumstances. So there's lots of firms offering sort of virtual online appointments and getting agreements signed off. So actually that's improved. Right at the beginning of the crisis, that was an issue, but at the moment that seems okay. Finally, I suppose thinking beyond those kind of strict legal issues of how do you achieve change, the broader themes that we're seeing is a lot more thought around what would consultation look like in future. A lot of businesses have found that they have got a gap in terms of how they can go to a whole workforce and consult on things. One good example is there's always been a requirement actually to try to seek employees' views on health and safety matters. I think that's been overlooked for years, and hasn't seemed that important, but now potentially seems crucial to have that employee forum, or mechanism or process in place where you can consult with employees and let them know issues within the business that will affect them on a day-to-day basis. So quite a few of our clients starting to look, I think, for the future at what their consultation groups might look like, and that it might be a good idea to sort of have standing groups available for this sort of scenario. And then separately to that, thinking about employer brand, it's really interesting that quite a few businesses now are starting to talk about returning furlough pay. The most recent one that I saw this morning was IKEA, who in the UK, I think, haven't claimed furlough pay, but have used similar schemes in other countries, and will be seeking to repay that. And there's a few other high-profile employers who have been looking at that as an option. It is perhaps something to think about if unexpectedly the business position hasn't been affected adversely, or even has been affected in a positive way. Would that be the right thing to do? And then more widely, obviously, if you're going through a period of change or difficulty, how can you try to protect the brand while going through that period? Social media, again, just really crucial, increasingly so. And during a period of disruption, what can you do to make sure that you try to contain any negative messaging? So certainly looking at social media policies, but I think that a level of investment in training of either employee reps, or more generally training employees who remain in the workplace and who you want to keep close to the business at this point, is a good idea. Potentially transparency about the issues that are affecting the business, where possible. You don't want to unduly worry employees, but if there are issues that are severely affecting the business and particularly might result in redundancies, I've seen lots of good processes in the last few months where actually the facts have been explained to employees and they've been given an opportunity, perhaps via trade union representatives or in small groups, to think about how they as a team might respond to those challenges. And it's quite heartening in some cases to see groups coming together and designing solutions. For example, they might suggest a number of part-time arrangements in order to bring down the cost of the team overall whilst not losing any headcount. So I think, thinking about how you consult with employees, what information you can give them about the situation that you're currently in. And finally, thinking about the new working arrangements. I think we're all talking and thinking about what will the future look like, how much time would be spent in the office, how will things change in the future. And there's actually some really interesting studies coming out in terms of employees' expectations on that, certainly around home working, where employees feel that argument has now been answered in terms of they can prove that they can do it, and it works really well. So what will the expectations be in future? I think it's a good opportunity, if redesigning workplace arrangements, to think about diversity and inclusion. Perhaps it means that you can engage with a much wider workforce geographically when you're recruiting. If people are going to be working remotely, do they need to be, local to the business, or can you now reach further afield? What can be done in terms of career development at a time where there's lots of pressures on the business and perhaps recruitment or promotion processes are being put on hold, and all of that, I think, being taking some time to run through the sort of diversity elements and inclusion elements of that. I think it's a really interesting time for a bit of a reset, really, on brand and values. And certainly I think those are the kind of themes that we're seeing coming through now, where some of the business as usual and or aspirational projects that were being parked are now coming back online. I think finally on that, for businesses who are experiencing a period of disruption with redundancies, thinking about the remaining workforce is really important. They will be affected by colleagues leaving. How do they feel about that? How do they feel if they have been a rep and had to support individuals through that process and are now going forward in the business themselves? So potentially it's a good time to plan in some time after redundancy round to settle people back down and to invest some time in some training or some looking again at sort of brand values and getting everyone focused on the future. We're all hoping for that bounce return, but we don't know what that will look like at the moment. And I know it's very different for very different organisations and businesses, and people are under pressure at the moment. And I think everything that can be done to look after employees, and if you are having to sadly look at exits, can anything be done around outplacement, counselling, or making contacts through your LinkedIn networks to make sure that, you know, as many opportunities as possible are given to help people move on to new roles. So that's all we had to say today. I hope you have found it helpful. Our team is here, we're available, we're working really hard at the moment, responding to lots of different queries. I think we've absolutely come out of that first phase of sort of panic, and it is now those longer term projects looking to the future. After the webinar, our marketing team will share with you the slides, and there's also, as I said at the beginning, the opportunity to submit questions, but do contact any of us who've given this presentation or any of your usual contacts at Redundancy. We're just going to run a final poll before we leave in relation to redundancies, just to get a picture really of how best we can support you in future with the projects that you might be working on now. We hope that you're finding these helpful. We'd love to run another one. I'm thinking that the next topic that might be really useful would be around data, working from home, data protection, all those kind of security issues. And we're really lucky to have a very experienced data team who I think will help with that. So do keep an eye out for that webinar coming out. But for now, thank you for joining us and take care.
Redundancy, powering your ambition.